issues. He questions what accounts for falling fertility during the transition to growth. He also questions how women's rights and economic development are related to each other, how culture and economic growth are related to each other, how the quality of public education is affected by the presence of private schools for the rich, and he provides a political economy angle to it. With Fabrizio Zilibotti, he develops a theory of parent-child relations that can rationalize the choice between alternative parenting styles, where different parenting styles emerge as equilibrium outcomes, and they talk about intergenerational preference transmissions. Their recent book named Loved, Money and Parenting is an instant hit. Today, he's going to talk about the issue of gender equality, but in the context of a pandemic hit world. COVID-19 has serious impact on labor force participation, and Matthias' question remains whether that has a differential effect on men and women. More precisely, he's going to talk on the impact of the global recession induced by the COVID-19 pandemic on women's versus men's employment. So without further delay, I'd like to request Matthias to take the floor. Matthias, please.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. I'm very excited to be here. Not excited to not be here in person, but I hope we can make up for that some other time. And that, of course, is another manifestation of the moment in time that we find ourselves in, namely in a global pandemic that has led to a global economic downturn that in some ways is a standard recession, many of which we have seen before, but in some ways is very different from other recessions we have seen before. And so this research I want to talk about today is about one aspect of how and why this recession is different, namely the impact on women's employment versus men's employment. You see here in this picture, one of the reasons I'm going to come back to a number of times for why we have these different outcomes, which is that the pandemic has placed, to a large extent, both parents and children in the home at the same time. So here we have a girl hanging out with her mom, I guess, in a closet. The girl is probably home because childcare became unavailable during the pandemic. So daycare centers have closed. Contact with nannies, maybe grandparents, is no longer as easily possible or as advisable. And at the same time, the mother here is working from home. Also, maybe because of restrictions and shutdowns, maybe also because of the necessity of caring for a child at the same time. So how all these spheres of childcare, parenting, and employment crash is what this is about. So that's kind of a one picture. That's a micro image of this conflict, but it shows up in a really big way at the macro level. And so I want to first show you what this implies in terms of women's versus men's employment, here measured by unemployment. So this is a picture of U.S. recessions, and for each of the U.S. recessions since 1949, we plot the difference in the rise between women's and men's unemployment. So a negative number here means that men's unemployment rose by more than that of women. A positive number means that women's unemployment rose by more. So women were more affected by job loss during a recession. So you had a bigger recession for men back in 1949. Some special factors played a role there, perhaps because of World War II. But you look at the 1950s to 1970s, you see that these numbers are all pretty much around zero. So these earlier recessions had very similar impact on women versus men. And this is essentially a phase where the female labor force essentially consisted of younger women before getting married, before having children, because the labor force participation of married women was still relatively low. From there, we came into this phase of high participation of married women in the labor market in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And we see here that all of these recessions from 1980 to the financial crisis of 2009 have large negative numbers here, meaning more men lost jobs than women did. So these are called sometimes Mancessions. These are recessions where men did quite bad. One reason being that, for example, many men work in jobs like construction and manufacturing, where job losses tend to be concentrated in recessions. So this is kind of the usual pattern, that either it's kind of balanced or that a man do worse. And now we arrive in 2020, we arrive in the pandemic recession. So we had a huge increase in unemployment, more than 13% at the peak. And what you see here is that it was not only large unemployment, it was much higher unemployment for women than for men. So at the peak of unemployment, we had 2.9% larger rise in unemployment for women compared to men. So opposite sign of a usual recession. So women were affected more this time, and also larger magnitude. So this is by far the largest absolute number. There never has been a US recession that has affected one gender so much more than the other. And in this recession, it was the women that bore the brunt of this economic downturn. Okay, so that is kind of the initial observation that we start from. Why is this happening? Well, I'm going to talk about a few different reasons, but one I will come back to is this role of childcare. So this is just one picture illustrating the potential role of childcare in this outcome. This picture shows you the change in the gender gap in employment. So a negative number here means that women's employment falls relative to that of men. A positive number means it increases relative of men. And we use kind of these employment changes to compare, first of all, the Great Recession to the pandemic recession. So dashed line is the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, the financial crisis, and the solid lines are the pandemic recession. And then more importantly, we compare the outcomes for people without children to those who have children under the age of 18 at home. So essentially outcomes for parents. If you look at the two dashed lines up here, you see that the black and the red line are kind of very similar. So whether or not you had a child didn't really matter for outcomes of employment in the Great Recession of 2007, 2009. And also, these numbers are all positive and they get larger over time. So in the course of the Great Recession and the recovery afterwards, women gained employment relative to men, kind of independently of whether they had children or not. But if you now look at the pandemic recession, you see that the black line for those without kids is first going down, but it's roughly balanced around zero. Whereas for those with kids, it's a very large negative impact, -6%, and it stays essentially depressed throughout the recovery, is still quite low today. So this tells you that mothers lost about 6 percentage points of employment relative to fathers in the beginning of the recession, and they're still about 4 percentage points down today. So it's not just a women versus man story, it's also a mothers versus father story. Childcare seems to be important. Of course, this picture is just a picture. There could be other variables behind that. It might be because of the jobs that women hold, or maybe because of other observables that differ across. So you kind of ultimately want to do this in a more detailed way using regressions. But the basic story is going to hold up. That childcare is going to be quite important for understanding these differences. Okay, so what I showed you so far was just a couple of pieces of data for the United States that does suggest that this recession was totally unusual in terms of the impact on women, and also that childcare seems to be an important reason, an important component. Starting from these observations, so what we do in this research project that I want to talk about today is answer the following questions. So the first one is whether these patterns we observe for the United States, whether these patterns are general, do they hold across many countries, or is it something very specific to the United States? We're going to look at data from a variety of countries to see if it's true in general that regular, meaning non-pandemic recessions are Mancessions, affecting men more. Is it true in most countries that the pandemic recession that we go through right now affects women more than men? Then we're going to look into the causes. So we're going to ask how much of this can be accounted for by childcare, how much of it can be accounted for by other factors, such as the kind of jobs that women versus men hold. That could also be an industry and occupation story. And then, ultimately, and of course, my background as a macroeconomist comes here into play. Ultimately, we are also interested in the wider implications of that. Does it really make a difference for the macroeconomy if a women versus men lose jobs? Or is some of the whole nature of the downturn and the recovery different because people of a different gender are affected. And so this will bring some macroeconomic analysis into this picture. Today we'll primarily talk about data, but I will mention kind of ultimately how this will fold on into a wider macroeconomic story. Now, let me say right away that what I'm showing you today is what we did first, namely is to look primarily at high-income countries. In particular, we're going to look at European countries, Canada, and the United States. So a more limited set of countries that's relatively similar. We are in the process of expanding this work to also middle and low-income countries around the world. We've done a lot of work already on sub-Saharan Africa and some other work too. So I will briefly comment on that at the end of the talk. There's definitely some parallels that hold really across a very wide range of countries, but there's also important differences, which I think will be important to get to in future research. Now, all of this is a really evolving project with the number of co-authors. So the first thing we did on this already in April 2020 was essentially making a forecast of what the impact on women in the labor market was going to be, based on childcare duties and also based on sector and industry of employment of women versus men, which kind of outline many of these facts that we then ended up seeing afterwards. And since then, we have two completed papers, another ongoing papers. The one I'm going to talk about most is this last one over here, from Mancession to Shecession, Women's Employment in Regular and Pandemic Recession, which is primarily an empirical paper looking at outcomes across a range of countries. So I want to show you the results of that today. This is coming out in the NBR Macro Annual. We also have more like a macro theory, macro modeling paper that tries to work out how the differential impact on women versus men makes a qualitative impact on how the economy reacts to the shock of the recession. Okay, but today primarily I will talk about this third step over here. So having said that, let's just jump straight into it. So I'm going to now talk about this first question that we're asking, namely, is it the case that these patterns of regular and pandemic recessions, that they are similar across countries? So the first question is whether regular recessions, so meaning recessions that happened before the current pandemic, that they affect men more so than women in the labor market. And you can do this in different ways, and we have a few different ways of doing it in the paper. I'm just going to show you kind of a picture that kind of really contains the basic message. So what we have here is a simple correlation of the ratio of women's to men's employment, so relative male to female employment, and the correlation of that with deviations of GDP from a trend. Okay, so just a fluctuation of GDP across a long run trend. Okay, so if this correlation is positive, that would mean that women's employment is more pro-cyclical than men's employment. So relative employment is pro-cyclical. And negative employment means that women's employment is counter-cyclical, and therefore implying that men are more exposed to the crisis. So men's employment would decline more. In the downturn, women's employment would decline less. And what you see here is that in the set of countries, which is most of Europe, the US and Canada, that in the vast majority of countries, it's indeed the case that regular recessions are Mancessions. So the correlation between the business cycle and women's relative employment is negative, and quite strongly negative. So in the United States, it's almost 0.8 negative correlation. You don't see that strong correlations much at all in macroeconomics. And a number of other countries are kind of in the same range, kind of a very strong negative correlation. There's others where it's a bit more mild. France, Norway, Sweden are kind of more 0.4, 0.5. There's a very few exceptions where it's the other way around. So Belgium, Greece, and Romania are countries that are mildly in the other direction. The women are more affected by downturns in terms of employment, although the absolute value of these correlations is quite low. So I think the basic summary would be that in most countries, regular recessions are Mancessions, and there are some exceptions where there is not that much of a difference between women and men. You can also do the same picture on the intensive margin. So the first one showed you employment, just how many people work. This shows you the same information, but in terms of hours worked. And you get really a very similar picture. There's a bit of a difference here now in the identity of the countries. So Greece had slightly pro-cyclical women's employment, but has counter-cyclical women's hours. but the basic picture is the same. So in most countries, we have a very strong negative correlation between women's versus men's labor supply and GDP. Okay, so this kind of summarizes that basic fact that regular recessions just happen to affect a man a lot more, at least in the most recent historical period. And so this data is from the last 25 years or so. So, of course, this is conditional on the current structure of employment, and in particular, the fact that the women's labor force participation is now quite high, including many women working in the formal labor market. Okay, so that answers question one. Moving on to question two, which is this question of whether this current recession, the pandemic recession, affects women more than men, just as it does in the United States. Okay, so here we look not at correlations, we look directly at changes. We simply look at what is the change in the ratio of women's to men's employment during this current downturn from just before the pandemic. So we look at the last quarter of 2019 to the height of the pandemic, which here in most countries is the second quarter of 2020. So a straight change. Okay, and so here the picture is maybe a little bit more mixed, but still on balance, you see that most countries have at least qualitatively the same outcome as the United States, namely a recession that affects women more. So here negative numbers mean that that women lose more jobs than men. So all of these negative numbers would be a Shecession. Okay, and the positive numbers would be more the usual pattern of men losing more jobs. Okay, and so you certainly see more countries on the Shecession side where women lost more jobs. The United States over here is relatively high up in this, so has a kind of a large Shecession, but not the largest one. So Canada, Estonia, Slovenia are even larger, and kind of a wide range of countries also go in that same direction. There's a limited set of countries that go in the other way. Austria, Germany are among the larger countries that go in the other direction of women losing fewer jobs. And as in the previous picture, we can again distinguish employment versus hours. So this is employment, simply do you hold a job or not? Importantly, during this pandemic, even if you hold on to a job, your hours could be totally different, because in many cases, countries used furlough policies that allowed you to formally hold on to a job, but work many fewer hours. In some countries, maybe even 0 hours. So in Germany, for example, many people held on to a job, but really stopped working, were just paid by government transfers during that time. So hours might be particularly informative for this pandemic. And here's now that same picture in terms of hours. So here we have again the post-COVID change in labor supply, but now measured by hours, the intensive margin. And here you see the outcomes across countries. And once again, you see in the majority of countries negative outcomes. So you see that the majority of countries, women lost more jobs, more hours, more work than men did. Again, with some exceptions, but the majority is over here on this negative side. Germany, for example, was one of those countries where women held on to more jobs. But even in Germany, women's labor supply declined quite substantially compared to men. If you look at absolute numbers, you'll see that the hours changes are much larger than the employment changes. So here on the employment side, the largest downturn was like about 4%. And really not that many countries had more than a 2% gap between employment changes between women and men. But here you see the scale is different. So you have a large set of countries that have 4% or more large declines in hours for women than for men. Okay. Again, with some exceptions, but it's certainly a widespread pattern that women suffered more in this recession compared to the usual case. Now, in terms of comparing this to previous recessions, we see now here some examples of countries where women's employment did not go down as far as that of men. But of course, it's important to keep in mind that in regular recessions, men are already affected more. So one question you can ask, well, is this change maybe is it maybe still smaller than what you would expect based on the pattern of a usual recession? So we look at those at that question too, and this picture gives an illustration of that. So on this axis over here, we have the predicted change in women's labor supply and measured in terms of hours. Where predicted means based on the pattern of business cycles and women's versus men's employment from before the pandemic. Okay, so just do essentially a regression of women's employment on the business cycle and use that to predict how women's employment should have evolved relative to men's in this recession. Then over here we have the observed change in that same ratio. And so if these points were all the 45-degree lines, that would mean that these countries have a recession that really is exactly like the usual pattern. And what you can see here is that the vast majority of countries are to the right, so where the observed changes in women's versus men's hours are lower, they're more negative compared to the usual case. Okay, so compared to the benchmark of the pre-pandemic period, we do get that the majority of countries, almost all of these countries, have a larger impact on women compared to what you would expect based on pre-pandemic patterns. I should say there's a couple of examples. Ireland, not quite sure what's happening here. Sweden is also an exception, and Sweden is of course an interesting case because Sweden in Europe was really fairly alone in terms of their COVID policy, which really tried to minimize shutdowns and maybe even more importantly, try to minimize school closures. So it's quite unique that in Sweden there was barely any closure of schools at all. Very limited closures in April, May of 2020, and pretty much nothing after that. So there was really a prioritization of keeping schools and keeping daycares open. And so that might be one hint at some of the differences we're going to see emerging here later. Okay, so that is the basic pattern. So this shows us that regular recession tend to affect men a lot more than women. But in the pandemic recession, at least in a large set of countries, we have the opposite. All of a sudden, the women in many cases lost more jobs. The women in most cases lost more hours, ended up working less than men did during this economic downturn. Next, from here on, I want to move to some of the channels behind this. There's going to be multiple channels, but I'm going to focus on one that really stand out as making the biggest contribution. And the first one of this is the composition of employment in terms of industry and occupation. So I will start illustrating that by looking at the case of the United States, where some of these patterns are particularly stark. And so what I want to do to illustrate the role of industry and occupation, I'm going to compare patterns across both gender and industry and occupation. And I'm going to do this for the Great Recession in 2007-2009, which was one of these regular recessions affecting men more, and compare that to the pandemic recession that we are still going through today. So in this picture for the Great Recession, this is data from 2007-2009. We're going to see a correlation of two things. So the first one over here is what we call cyclical volatility. You can think of cyclical volatility as the volatility of employment in an industry that is correlated with the business cycle. And so like a higher number would mean, first of all, that the employment in this industry is more volatile in general, but more importantly, that this volatility is correlated with the economic cycle. So construction, for example, has by far the highest cyclical volatility. It's a volatile sector, and this volatility is very strongly correlated with the business cycle. Education and healthcare is essentially zero, so has almost no cyclicality. Same with public administration; those are very safe jobs that don't really vary much over the cycle. Okay, so this acts as simply what are the usual characteristics of those industries. On this axis over here, we have the actual change of employment in these industries in the particular recession of 2007-2009, in the Great Recession. So it's one instance of this downturn, but it shows you this example. Okay? And you see pretty much exactly kind of a negative slope that shows that indeed the industries that are typically cyclical, they did lose many jobs in the Great Recession. Almost 20%, more than 20%. Loss in construction, for example, 50% in manufacturing. The industries that are normally not very cyclical, they didn't really lose many jobs. Okay. The final dimension is then gender. So I'm also having here different colors, and these different colors tell you which are the industries where many men versus many women are working. In particular, so the red industries are industries where the employment share of women is in the top 30% across industries. And so essentially we are sorting industries by women's employment shares, and we take the top third of that. So the 30% of industries with the highest women's employment shares. These are leisure and hospitality, other services, education, and health services. Black industries are somewhere in the middle, and the blue industries are industries that are in the top 30% of men's employment shares, so industries where many men work. And so what you see here in this picture at the end of the day is that women have safer jobs in regular recessions. And so that women's employment is concentrated in things like education, health services, and leisure and hospitality, industries that are not all that cyclical in regular recessions. Men's jobs are in manufacturing, construction, also to some extent transportation, information technology, more cyclical jobs, and so they lose more jobs. Okay, so this pattern of the industry composition of employment that plays really a big role in generating those regular Mancessions in other recessions before the current. Now I want to show you the same picture, everything the same, except we're doing the same thing now for the pandemic recession. So how does the structure across these same industries look like in this current downturn? And this is this picture here. So everything the same, still same industries, cyclical volatility, same gender, but now I show you on this axis the change in employment in the current COVID recession. So the change in industry from just before final quarter of 2019 to the peak of the recession. And so you see it's completely different. Now you see, first of all, that for the majority of industries, it's a flat line. So construction, manufacturing, education, and health services, they all have about a 10% loss of employment, almost no difference in the impact on these industries. So the degree to which an industry is usually cyclical seems to have very little impact on how much employment was lost in these industries in this current recession. There is exceptions, and the exceptions to these rules are essentially contact-intensive service. There are services where you're at some place, you're interacting with customers. Those services, of course, were shut down largely. They lost a lot of employment, and that gives you a very different outcome. So other services lose about 20% of employment compared to 10% for most other industries, so much bigger impact. And then beyond that, and by far the largest impact, is leisure and hospitality. So this includes hotels, includes restaurants in particular, which is a very big sector in the United States. That is really where a very large fraction of the employment losses in this pandemic were concentrated. And you see leisure and hospitality and also other services. These are red sectors. These are sectors in the top 30% of the female employment share. So these are industries where in the United States, a great many women are working. Okay. And so this tells you, one reason for why women were affected so much. Leisure and hospitality was hit very badly. Other services were hit very badly. Many women work in those sectors, they lost jobs, and that is going to give you a hit on employment. In fact, you kind of really see what a big outlier leisure and hospitality is here, and that kind of holds somewhat more generally. Like if you want to, even across countries, kind of characterize what really drives outcomes. If you just look at this one sector and kind of characterize, first of all, how big is it in this country, and then how many women work there, you're already getting quite a bit of a distance to understanding the impact in a given country on women versus men's employment. Okay, so far, this was the impact of sector and industry in the United States. Now, how does it look in other countries? So here's an illustration of what this looks like, and this is now directly for the pandemic recession. Okay, so what we did for the United States, we're doing this for all the countries. We're looking for the blue industries with high male employment share, the black industries which are kind of neutral, and the red industries with high female employment shares. And to kind of summarize this data, so we're now going to aggregate for each country the red, blue, and black industries into kind of one dot. So say this point for Canada is all the red industries combined. And you see this picture then the female employment share in that industry. So it's about 80% across the industries in Canada. Then here you see the actual change in employment in that country, in this industry, in the pandemic recession. Okay, And so in the usual case, what you would expect to observe is that the blue industries are lower than the red industries because they're more cyclical. But you see that's not the case here. So the overall slope of this relationship is slightly negative. So the red dots on average are kind of a bit lower than the blue dots over here. The black dots are kind of in the middle. And so some of these differences in industry and occupation distribution, they do account for some of this larger impact on women. At the same time, I mean, you do see that there is a large cross-country difference. And so the United States, that we just looked at in detail, is a bit of an outlier. And so it's kind of really very far down in terms of this negative employment share in the female-dominated industries. And this is in part because these sectors, such as hospitality, are really large in the United States. There's just many restaurants. Say Germans, for example, don't eat out as much as the Americans, and so there's just few restaurants out there. And also the employment impact was very large. And so some other countries tried much more to use furlough policies to keep people employed, even in those sectors. The US and also Canada didn't do it as much, and so you get a different impact. And so you see that some of this sectoral force shows up in many countries, but the extent of that impact certainly does vary across countries, depending on their structure of employment and on the role of these different industries. Okay, so what I've shown you so far essentially uses aggregate data. So we're using mostly from Eurostat, supplemented with survey data from the US and Canada, but we're kind of using this at the aggregate level. Of course, there's only so much you can learn really from aggregated data. So next we're going to go through some micro regressions where we can kind of look a bit more under the hood of exactly what is going on. But before going there, I mean, you can certainly look at these employment changes across countries and just see kind of what kind of factors are associated with larger employment changes in general, and also with larger employment changes for women in particular. This amounts to running cross-country regressions with like 28 data points, so it's not really high-level econometrics, but it's still interesting to see, I think, as a first kind of diagnostic, kind of what the associations are in that kind of analysis. So just to mention what the outcomes are there. So what you find across countries is that if you look at countries with larger school closures, you definitely get larger employment losses. And certainly if the schools close long, if there's a higher severity of school closures, say more children affected for a longer period, then employment goes down. Not surprisingly, parents have to be home, so there's going to be some impact of that. Also not surprising from the things we have seen before is the role of the hospitality industry. If you have a larger hospitality industry, if you have many restaurants, or if you're like a touristical country like Greece, like Spain, then you're going to have a larger impact on employment in your country. And finally, and this is something, a theme that's going to come back later to some extent, another thing that matters is the extent to which jobs can be done from home. So we know that many jobs during the pandemic were switched to being done from home, just like we're doing this talk today from home. Well, not quite from home, but at least far from where we usually would do it. And that turns out to be quite important across countries too. So if you categorize jobs by the extent to which they can be done from home, essentially office jobs that can be done remotely, countries that have more of those jobs are going to have smaller employment changes. Okay? Now, all of those things matter for overall employment. It turns out the only one that really matters a lot for women in particular is the last one. So if you look across countries, really the only thing that that really predicts a larger or smaller impact on women in particular is the fraction of jobs that can be done from home, where if there's more jobs you can done from home, there's more flexibility in working from home, then employment losses for women are smaller. And that's kind of one of the other themes really coming out of this paper, that the ability to work from home, telecommute, is really quite important for the impact on women in general and for how they react to this crisis. Okay, so that is essentially part one. So that was, kind of looking at overall data across countries. It is really suggestive of two things, of the sectoral distribution being important, in particular hospitality, and it's also suggestive of childcare being important. If you look, for example, at the role of school closures, and if you look at the jobs that can be done from home. I'm hearing a noise. I don't know if that was a question or that was unintended.
The question in the chat was answered.
Okay, so I cannot see the chat right now because I'm having my slides on.
So that's perfectly all right. Like I'll keep a watch on for the questions that come in the chat.
Okay. Okay. So moving on. So the next thing we do is look more at the micro evidence, and we want to look at the role of childcare. We want to look at the role of industry. You know, it's kind of easy to see that if you look at the microdata for a particular country and really use the micro level characteristics of these workers to see who is affected more. Of course, that requires more detailed data, which takes time to get. So for this analysis, we use microdata for 6 countries, namely United States, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, and the UK. And to some extent, this is because of data availability, but also because these countries give you kind of a nice variety of policies and initial conditions. Now, for example, Germany and the UK made really widespread use of furlough policies, so they really tried to protect employment. The US didn't. There's also differences in the initial use of childcare. So, you know, Netherlands, for example, and the UK have a lot more childcare availability compared to, say, Spain and Germany. So you can see some interesting differences there. Now, what we want to do with the microdata is to really focus on the differential impact on women. So what we're going to do is run a bunch of regressions of an outcome. Why IT think of this as something like employment, are you working or not? And we're going to regress this on individual characteristics, so it's a number of variables like education, age, and so on. And then we're going to run this on a female dummy, so women versus men, a pandemic dummy, so we're going to have data from before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And this DT dummy is the indicator variable for the pandemic. And then the variable of interest is the interaction between those two. So the interaction of being a woman, female, and the pandemic dummy, which is going to be then picking up this parameter beta 3. So this interaction term is going to give you the differential impact of the pandemic on women. So if beta 3 is negative, for example, it would tell you that the employment change for women is more negative than that for men. And so this regression essentially will give you a raw gender gap. It will tell you, controlling for other characteristics, how much more or how much less is women's employment or are women's hours affected by this economic downturn. In the second step, we want to decompose this effect. And so here we just know the overall impact on women, but then we kind of want to ask, well, how much of this is due to industry occupation? So maybe it might be because, say, more women work in restaurants, for example, as we already saw a bit about before, and also the role of childcare. And so how much of this is because women have to take care of kids during school closures and men don't, to explain these differences. So to get at these factors, we extend these regressions in 2 ways. First, we're going to introduce industry occupation variables. So this job variable is essentially a kind of a vector of indicator variables for kind of a large set of combinations of industry and occupation. And we allow differential time trends for these job types. Okay, so that means we allow for each type of job differential change for this job in the pandemic. Okay, so for example, if so this theta 5, it's a vector of parameters, will pick up these differential trends. If it were the case that women have different outcomes only because more women work, say, in restaurants and hotels, then this would be picked up by theta 5. It would have no effects then on the interaction of just being female and the pandemic dummy. Okay. So essentially this kind of takes care of the industry occupation story. And then on top of that, we're going to have the interaction of female with the pandemic as before, but then we're going to further subdivide this by whether or not somebody has a child at home. And so there's going to be this variable kid, which is another set of indicator variables, one for having no children at home, so either no children yet or children out of the house, one for having young kids at home, so before school age, and then one for having school age kids. So we can see how these gender gaps differ depending on whether or not you are a parent of a young and older child, and so that will be indicative of the role of childcare for explaining gender differences. Okay, and so I'm going to show you outcomes for these regressions. That will only show you the coefficients for gender. So I will show you beta 3 and these theta variables. Okay, I'm going to show you all the others just to focus on the kind of key gender gap. So in this table, every estimate in this table is a different regression. So on this dimension over here, we go across countries. So the 6 countries that we're looking at, and here we're going through different regressions. So this first one over here is the overall regression coefficient for women after controlling for industry and occupation effects. And then these next 3 are the 3 separate regression coefficients for women without kids, with young kids, with school-age kids, and with older kids. In each case, these numbers are measuring impacts relative to men. Okay? And you see a bunch of missing numbers here. To kind of make it easier to kind of see this picture, I'm only displaying the significant estimates. So in many cases, differences are small. And so there's not much of a gap between outcomes for women and men. And so then it's going to be omitted. Okay, so what do we see? So we see here employment. This is whether or not you have a job. We see that the after controlling for industry occupation effects, so after controlling, for example, women's higher employment in industries, in services, we're going to see a negative impact on women compared to men in the United States and Canada. It's about a bit more than a percentage point different in the United States, about half as much in Canada. And then over here, these are kind of broken down now into these 3 different groups. So young kids, school-age kids, and older kids. And here you see in both countries that by far the largest impact is among parents of school-age children. So mothers of school-age children have a 1.8 percentage points decline in employment compared to fathers of school-age children after controlling for industry and occupation effects. And so this is very much suggestive that school closures are quite important because, of course, these are the parents which would be most affected by school closures. Okay, so this first thing, yes.
Okay, if I may interrupt you here, there is a clarificatory question in the chat. So this is regarding the baseline specification that you showed 2 slides back. So the I can read out the question. It is the baseline regression is the DID model, right? So this is the first part of the question.
Right.
And the job type is similar to the industry type or different specific jobs?
Yes. So it's we're looking at the difference in difference. We're looking at difference between women and men and before and across the pandemic. So that's right. And the job type essentially is a combination of industry and occupation. So we have I think 12 industry groups and then a similar number of occupation types. And so it's kind of the combination of those. So a job type would be something like being a manager in the restaurant industry. Okay, so this first picture was for employment. This second picture moves to the intensive margin is for hours. Okay, so it's the same structure of regression for the different outcome variables. So you see now a few more significant numbers. So there's now more changes showing up here. The basic pattern is still the same. So we see quite a substantial overall gap, in particular in the United States and Canada. So it's about a 5 percentage point decline in women's employment on the intensive margin after controlling for this industry occupation effect, even larger in Canada. If you break it down by whether or not you have kids, you see that again the effects are the largest for parents of school-age children. So it's 9 percentage points larger for mothers of school-age children compared to men in the United States, even larger in Canada, and even in Spain and Britain, where we don't really have employment impact differential between women and men. Even there, it's true that for mothers of school-age children, there's a differential impact. Okay, so very much suggestive of the responsibility of caring for children during school closures playing an important role. So we see an indication of industry effects. We see an indication of childcare effects. Now, when we started doing this work, we thought this would be it. We kind of thought that once you control for those things, there should be nothing left. We thought that if you look at, say, a group of women and men who are young, don't have kids yet, work in the same industry, the same kind of job, they should have the same impact. But what you can also see that even though childcare is important, that there's something more going on, because we see here in the last row, so no kids, so looking at men and women who don't have childcare responsibilities right now, that even there we have a large negative number, as we have a large negative impact. Okay, and that is surprising because there's it's kind of harder to understand what exactly is going on here that gives you kind of these negative numbers here also. So even among women who don't have childcare responsibilities right now, even they lose 4 percentage points, 4% of hours compared to men in the same situation. And I think this is something that's still not fully understood. I think some conjectures include that maybe women are having other care responsibilities. So maybe they have, say, older relatives that need to be taken care of during the pandemic, during shutdowns, and so that might also show up here. Another conjecture is it might also be precautionary behavior, that maybe women, which there's evidence for, were just more concerned about the health risks and therefore kind of voluntarily step back a bit from working as much as before during the pandemic. At any rate, this is something that we didn't expect. I think it's something that we still need to understand a bit better. Just to point out how different this is. So this is now, if you look at the United States, 4.2% decline for this group of women without kids. It's really totally different from regular recessions. So here's the same recession for the Great Recession, 2007, 2008. And so here the same number is about 2% with a positive sign, it's the opposite side. So in a regular recession, after controlling for childcare, after controlling for industry occupation, women do better in the pandemic recession than it worse. So these reasons of industry, occupation, and childcare, they're certainly not exhaustive, but they're part of the story. Okay, so these results, I mean, they should certainly show you variation across countries, but they do confirm this intuition that industry, occupation, and childcare are quite important. You can, of course, then use these regressions to do a bit of a decomposition. If you take the overall results, and I'm doing it here for the United States, and decompose how much is due to each channel, you get that actually quite a bit is still unexplained. It's something that goes beyond these factors. So in the baseline regressions, we get that the childcare accounts between 14 and 20% roughly of the overall impact on women's employment compared to men. Occupation industry also between 13 and 20%. Now the childcare channel, that's about probably about right, because at the end of the day, the majority of the labor force does not currently have children at home. There's a limited number of parents out there. They have a limited amount of labor supply, so there is an upper bound to how much this could possibly do. And so 20% is about, I think, as far as you could expect to find for the childcare channel. Now the occupation industry channel is a bit different because that's in fact not that easy to measure in the CPS, in particular for employment, because the CPS doesn't ask you for your occupation if you're not currently working. So there's a bit of a missing data issue. If you look alternatively just at hours changes for people who are employed, so just at the intensive margin, you get about 20% for childcare, about 50% for occupation industry, and about 28% left, which seems, I think, maybe a more appropriate measure, because here we have all the data to work with. And so that would be about half for the industry occupation structure, about a fifth for childcare, and then quite a bit still left to be explained by something else. Okay, so let's see. I have 15 minutes. I think I won't talk much about things over time. Things have persisted. We can maybe talk about the recovery a bit later, because I want to get to another issue, which is this role of working from home. And this role of working from home, I think, is particularly important because it not only speaks to the situation that we went through already, kind of the height of the pandemic, but it also speaks a lot to what will happen in the future. So I think one expectation we have for the changes that this pandemic will bring to the workplace is that working from home will become much more common, that people will have many more jobs they can do from their basement or their home office as opposed to the usual workplace. And we see these changes already happening with many firms downsizing the offices with the idea that working from home will be a more permanent thing. So it's interesting to see what working from home did during the pandemic. And it's kind of starting to see that it actually plays a hugely important role for gender gaps, because what you can see here is that there's in fact almost no gender gaps at all among workers who are able to work from home. If you take a sample of teleworkers, think of academic faculty, pretty much anybody who's a professor or assistant professor or researcher anywhere worked from home during the pandemic, and pretty much nobody got laid off. We just kept on working out of our basements. This is true more generally. that among people who were able to work from home, you see very little changes in employment and labor supply. These are really concentrated among workers who cannot telecommute, and then they affect women a lot more. You can do this as regressions. Here's this just kind of the same information kind of as raw data. So here you can see the hours worked during the pandemic. This is the intensive margin for women and men, whether or not you can telecommute or not, and whether or not you have children of school age, young age, or no children at all. Okay, and so if you look at the numbers over here for the men, well, there's a bunch of them, but you see they're all about the same. You know, they go from 39 to 41 for men. It doesn't make much of a difference which kind of job they have. It doesn't make a difference if they have kids. They just keep on working more or less the same amount of time. For women, if you look at the telecommuting row over here, it's 38 hours. If you don't have kids, it's 35 with young kids. Of course, you know, some childcare there, but then it goes pretty much to a similar level for those with older kids. If you look at those who can't telecommute, this is where the big gaps are. And so during the pandemic, women who were not able to work from home and who had little kids worked only 30 hours, so more than 5 hours less than those in the same situation with jobs you can do from home. If they had middle school kids, still about 4 hours less compared to the other kids. So it's really concentrated on those women, which is very suggestive of telecommuting being very protective and not having those jobs being kind of a much higher exposure to the risk of not being able to work. Okay, so this is the evidence, you know, that we collected here. So what do we find? We find that the childcare channel seems to be quite important. Can account for about 20% of the gender gap in the countries where we can measure this in some more detail, which is about as much as it could be, you know, given just the fraction of parents in the labor force. Industry occupation is also important, and you know, I didn't talk much about it here, but certainly policies like employment protection, furlough policies are also quite important. And then finally, a very important rule of telecommuting. So whether or not you can work from home has a big impact on how you're affected by this crisis. Okay, so at this point, I want to mention one caveat, you know, kind of regarding the future of the labor market. It's just looking at this evidence, you know, one thing one might conclude is that if you look forward, that this ability to work from home is a bit like a kind of a magic, like a secret sauce, you know, that will make this pandemic itself much better. That will also make it much easier for women to kind of combine childcare and work in the future, because we saw already so little of an impact on working women during the crisis if they were able to telecommute. The caveat that comes up here is that this might not be completely accurate, because we're just able to measure employment and hours. We cannot really measure how much you're actually getting done. You know, and so I think one concern that I think maybe many of you who have also been working from home during the crisis is, of course, the question of are you actually getting your work done? Are you actually being productive while you're at home? And on top of that, well, are you productive at home? But also, how does it depend on whether the kids are at home at the same time? Because you might be able to hang on to your job and still do your classes while you're at home, but maybe as long as your 3 kids are running around and you have to help them with homeschool, maybe it's actually very difficult to get those research papers done and submit them to journals. You know, and this picture here is an illustration of that. This is from a New York Times article that looked at a bunch of families in the pandemic. Here you have a couple with a child, you know, and these 2 parents, they in fact have the same job, you know, so they're both psychologists who work with clients online. But you see him being very happy in his beautiful home office, and her taking care of the diaper change while she also with her earpiece is doing a work call at the same time. Now, if it's the case that the burden of childcare still falls mostly on mothers, even while they're working at home, it's not so clear that the productivity implications will be the same for women and for men. And well, there is in fact some evidence that this is the case. You know, so there is direct evidence already coming out about productivity. So, for example, productivity in academia, there's a number of studies that show that academics with young children working from home, you know, their productivity dropped quite substantially during the pandemic, Whereas academics without kids, they could just happily write many papers from their basement and just carry on going. You can also see this in time use. So here's from the Dutch data that we've been using. There's some information on how workers who work from home actually spend their time during the day, and you see here, how much childcare these workers do while they're also working from home. And so mothers report that they are spending about 6% of their work time also doing childcare. So at the same time monitoring some kid in the background, trying to organize some homeschooling. Fathers is 10 percentage points lower. If you look at mothers of older kids, it's even higher. And you can do the same thing, not just for homework, but also fraction of all works. In each case, it comes out that the mothers are spending a larger fraction of their time on also supervising children. That, of course, is an important caveat, because it could mean that even the women who were protected in terms of employment during the pandemic, they might still, pay a penalty in terms of, say, less career advancement, because they didn't get as much work done, didn't get, say, as many papers written, as many papers published as others without those same issues. Okay. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind, kind of what the clash of work and childcare is at home and how it affects your productivity. Okay, so that puts me to the end of empirics. So some things we've seen in the data. Now I want to use my last few minutes to briefly talk about what this actually means from a macro perspective. So I'm a macroeconomist, so I'm interested in all of this empirically, but I'm also interested in macro models and how the economy evolves in response to shocks and how the recovery might look like. Okay.
Yeah,
And
Matthias, sorry to interrupt you. You have around 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes. Yeah, you can continue.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just a couple slides left, so we're definitely on track. So you might come with this question as well. Does it really make a difference for the macro economy? There's women, there's men, they're both workers. Does it make a difference for the economy as a whole if one versus the other loses employment? And so in this paper, that we've also written on the macro theory perspective, building on a bunch of recent work that's more generally concerned with family labor supply and macroeconomics, we argue that yes, it actually does make a difference. And it does make a difference because women's labor supply is qualitatively very different than man's labor supply. Man's labor supply is in many countries, and sometimes it's very simplistic. So most prime age men essentially work all the time or are looking for work all the time. So when men in prime age years lose employment, they tend to go into unemployment until they find a new job and they go back into employment. This employment tends to be full-time. We don't really see that many men working part-time. It's a bit different in older ages. So when you look at the 50s and 60s, of course, there's early retirement. There's a bit of decline in participation recently in some countries. Still, compared to men, it's really like that men work full-time most of the time or look for work. Women's labor supply is a lot more flexible. So there's a lot more women who work part-time. There's a lot more women who spend time out of the labor force, maybe because of childcare responsibilities or other forms of work in the home. And this means that the qualitative impact of a shock to women's labor supply is going to be different than that of men. So one part of that we talk about in our research is this idea of women's labor supply as a shock absorber. So when lots of men lose jobs, often you have the possibility of their spouses, of their partners, absorbing some of this income shock to the family by working more, because there's many women who work part-time or who are out of the labor force who can increase the labor supply and contribute more to the family income. So as a reaction, there's an offsetting effect of women's labor supply to shocks happening to their husbands. In the opposite direction, the shock absorber doesn't work, because men already either work full-time or they're unemployed, but they're usually not in a position to just increase the labor supply in some deliberate fashion. So the shock absorber works very differently depending whether you have a Shecession or a Mancession, and that will have implications for how labor supply evolves. It will have implications for how consumption evolves, so how strongly income shocks get transmitted into aggregate demand in the economy. That is one qualitative difference. A second qualitative difference has to do with the persistence of these impacts. So you can look at the short run, you can look at 3-6 months around the crisis, but you can also look at the question of well, how is the overall recovery from this pandemic going to be affected in the 2, 4, 6 years after this shock initially hit. And the thing that's important to observe there is that women's labor supply is a lot more persistent. Again, because I already mentioned that men's labor supply is essentially almost always on. So if they lose a job, well, at some point they're going to find a new job and they will just be back in the labor force. For women, it is much more likely if they lose a job that they will decide to stay out, that they leave the labor force altogether, at least for some period of time. You can observe that even in regular recessions, that women who lose jobs in regular recessions, they are much slower to come back into employment afterwards. That's also true in this current pandemic recession. In the US, for example, kind of a big thing people talk about in the macro economy right now is that we have this somewhat unusual situation that unemployment is now extremely low. So it's a very tight labor market, but participation is still quite a bit below the pre-pandemic peak. And it's in particular below the peak for women. So many women haven't come back into the labor force. To some extent, this is childcare, but not all of it. There's many women who are not taking care of little children who also have decided to step back for some time and leave the labor force at least for the next few years or so. So you're going to get a very different persistence, during the recovery of employment if you have a Shecession versus a Mancession. So these are, I think, important differences, which, Albanese, Bardocci, and us too kind of argue is something that should be maybe explored a bit more widely. In macro, we care about aggregate labor supply, but that's really the women's labor supply that's a lot more variable, a lot more interesting, a lot more different between different types of recessions. And so really putting this explicitly in our models, I think, will be beneficial for understanding recessions in general, will be particularly beneficial in this recession that has affected women so much more than others. Last thing I want to say just briefly is to talk about developing countries. So what I've shown you today is this first round of work, which has been focusing on Europe and US and Canada, mostly high income economies. Of course, another thing that's characteristic about the pandemic is it's completely global. It's affected every country around the world. So we are now working, and I mean, a lot of work has already been done by various teams of authors, but we've also done some work on this now. I've been working on comparing the outcomes for women versus men between high-income countries to those in middle and low-income countries. Okay, and I don't have tables on this at this point, but let me just kind of point out a couple of basic observations on that. So I think one thing that's really quite different and that plays a big role in this comparison is that you have a large difference in the structure of occupation and industry. And not so much in the urban area, so cities in different countries kind of look similar, but low-income countries, of course, have often a much larger agricultural sector, a much larger informal sector. In particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, family-based agriculture is still a very large share of employment. And of course, the direction in those sectors is quite different than, say, in the contact-intensive services in the United States. So industry occupation is quite different. At the same time, there's also similarities, and kind of a big similarity is the policy response. So most countries responded with various kinds of shutdowns and closures. Most countries responded with school closures. So schools were closed for the vast majority of kids around the world, with quite a bit of variation in the length of these closures, but the instance is fairly universal. And so based on these factors, what we have seen so far is that this aspect of childcare seems to be shared across many countries. So that the higher load of childcare and also other forms of kind of housework and work at the home, that the majority of the burden of this work fell on women and therefore affected women's employment more. And we see that in a variety of countries. There's also a number of studies in India already that's showing this, at least for the urban areas. At the same time, we see different outcomes in rural areas, where there's a different industry structure. And I think we also see first indications that the recovery comes out quite different. I haven't done this for many countries yet, but right now we're looking, for example, at data from Nigeria, which is the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa. And there we see actually that employment bounces back quite quickly after the height of the pandemic. It's higher now than it was before the pandemic. Now, one conjecture is that some of this might be income effects, so that say a place like the United States used very generous transfers, so households actually had very high income and a high savings rate. They were, in a sense, able to afford to work a little less, whereas that is not the case in many of the lower income countries. And of course, the economic shock there can have often more severe consequences just for the ability to afford daily life. And so that there's a reaction in terms of just wanting to work more just to be able to provide a basic income to the family. So these income effects, I think, also are a source of differential recoveries in different kinds of countries in this current pandemic. But there's clearly still a ton of more work to be done on this. Kind of interesting issues coming up here. Also, how the macro reaction will be different given the different economic structure of these countries. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. So I think we see that the pandemic recession is a recession affecting women more in many countries. We see that industry, occupation, and childcare are important parts of this. And we also see that the ability to work from home plays an important role in mitigating and transmitting these effects. And all of this, I think, is quite important for what's going on right now, for the shape of the recession and for the shape of the recovery. And is ultimately also going to be important for the evolution of gender equality in the labor market, because some of these changes that are happening now, such as greater flexibility of work, more access to working from home options, these changes will have implications for gender inequality in the future of the labor market in many countries around the world. Thank you very much, and of course I'll be happy to answer some more questions if you have them.
Thank you, Matthias. Very nice talk. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let us open the floor for questions. Nikita, please.
The participants, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and you can also post the question in the chat. Okay. So Soumya Sri.
So yes, Samasri, you go ahead. Yeah, ask the question, please.
Yes, hello. Am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, yes.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much for the session. Sir, I had a very basic question. While working with a lot of tribal districts, what I could find out is, like, a lot of women associate care work as a part of their duty, right? So even though they are professionals, like not only tribals, even the people who come from basic rural places, the ones who have got a job, but they believe that it is their duty to care for the children. It's their duty to take the family forward when their husbands go to work, or when their husbands are doing a work from home scenario. And if they believe that the sacrifice comes with their gender, do we accommodate this kind of a belief in the model, or do we actually build on that model, like build on this belief, or like how does it go? This belief doesn't come from the education or anything. It's just a very outside eliminated factor, but something that works a lot in Indian scenario. As in, it's your duty, it's your sacrifice, it's how you become a mom or how you become a wife. So all of these things, I believe, contributes heavily to the way the model works. I mean, the way a lot of people lose out on the participation rate, societal pressure, that as in, how do you prioritize your work when your husband is working, or maybe is not getting a 3-course meal, a proper meal, hot food kind of. So how do we accommodate for these things?
I think it's a very important point, and I think that is true. I'm sure it's true in India, but it's really true around the world, certainly to different extents. But in the United States, it's also true, that if you look at who does care work, what really is most predictive is just gender. It's not relative income. So you see, for example, that even in households where, say, the wife has a higher income, has a better career, makes more income, is the primary earner of the family, even then it's the case that women do the majority of the childcare, the majority of the other housework. So that kind of very much suggests that it's really not just economics, not just optimal specialization.
Yes, sir, definitely.
it is
Yes,
role
sir.
models, is pre-existing gender attitudes that play a role in that. And and I totally agree with you. You cannot really understand the data with ignoring that. You kind of have to take account of that. And so in our modeling work, so we do that. So one thing we have as part of that model is what we call the social norm. Essentially, it's not every couple, but it's a fraction of couples that just for some unmodeled reason kind of value the wife doing more of the care work, which in that model is childcare. So essentially, it's modeled as a utility cost of men doing more care work than the women, or you can think of it as a utility benefit of the wife doing more of it. And so you kind of have to have those features in there to account for the data. Now, I think there's two interesting things going on. So one interesting thing is that we see, at least in some countries, that the pandemic gave an unusual situation that really pushed many families to step outside of those usual gender-based arrangements. And that is really a function of what kind of jobs and occupations couples have. So in the United States, we look at this in some detail. In the majority of couples, it's the case that the mother is going to do more of the care work and did more of the care work, say, during school closures. But there's also about 9 million US couples where you have a constellation where the husband has a work that can be done from home, like an office worker, like an academic, and the wife has a job that cannot be done at home. So the wife, let's say, is maybe a nurse or a doctor in the hospital, or maybe she's working in the grocery store and has to be there physically. So it's a situation where just the kind of jobs really force the husband to be home and then to kind of take over more of the childcare. And so you actually do have a reversal of role models, of gender roles in many households, not because of like a conscious choice or discussion, but just because of the necessity of taking care of the children at home during the recession.
Yes, sir.
And so it's an interesting moment because it kind of really, I think, forces at least some couples to question, the origin and the appropriateness of these gender roles. And you do find at least anecdotal evidence that a good number of couples say, well, this really has changed our lives to see that men can do this too, and that maybe there is a better way of arranging our childcare work in a way that is not so lopsided. So that's happening in the crisis.
Definitely. Sir, I would like to add to it.
So I have a few more questions here. So
Okay, sir.
Can you just make your question short, like very short, if you have like a very
Yes, sir. Like the only thing that I wanted to say right now is, since before the pandemic, the pre-pandemic era, caregiving was limited. A lot of places, caregiving services like nurses were limited to women. And now that these nurses have a role to play, the women have to go out and the roles have got reversed. I think that could be an important factor for a model if it ever comes out.
Yes, I think it's a good point. And it would be interesting to see how this plays out forward if some of these things are going to change.
Yeah, let us go to the next question. Mr. Somesh Mathur, yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Well, we know that the pandemic has impacted men and women differentially in terms of wages, in terms of employment, in terms of the COVID infections. And we also know that this COVID spread or Omicron spread is more, has impacted the nations which have had far better health capacities. So what I wish to know from you is that are these men and women who have been impacted differentially, women who stay in the developed nations, have they been impacted more, or is it the low-end jobs which have got impacted more as far as women is concerned? Right.
Yeah, it's really a combination of the two. So there's certainly, I think we saw the data I showed you that just being female, has a big impact. So that control for everything else that plays a role. But of course, it does intersect with the kind of work that you do, the kind of jobs that you have. And we've only talked about some dimension of heterogeneity. Of course, in the US context, there's also a clear correlation, say, of the type of job you have with other factors such as your income. And so it happens to be the case that workers with low income are much more likely to have the kinds of jobs that are more exposed, service sector jobs, jobs that cannot be done from home. And so there's also kind of a very strong correlation with inequality. So it's certainly gender is as one dimension of inequality that I think we worry about, but it does kind of correlate quite closely with others, which I think make this more concerning.
Right. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Let us move to the next question. Kundan, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. So one of the features of, say, the Great Recession or the other recessions in the US has been that if you look at the employment trend, the women employment, actually it was a lagging indicator, because you had this budget cuts, state and local government revenue shortfalls. They had a huge budget cut, and then then the employment of women usually fell after the recession period ended. I mean, the usual classical NBR recession. And then also the recovery in the employment was much more slow, because the revenue shortfalls were, it took some time for them to adjust. So just looking at the recessionary period may not be giving us a full picture of how the employment is behaving over time, especially just after the recession.
Yes, I think it's a good point. So we could, because we have shown you just pictures of that, but we could further break it down by sector. And I think you're right. It will be interesting to see how the impacts of different sectors differ in the cyclicality. So certainly, I think the public sector is a good example of that, where everything is a bit slower moving, and so you just could have a different cyclicality. We did find that, so we looked specifically at long-term outcomes, conditional unemployment. So we looked at if you lose a job today, how likely are you going to get back into employment? And that was definitely quite different for women and men, but I think the factor that you mentioned would also be interesting to look at there.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, we have
Could I ask a
around
question?
1 minute. Sorry. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was wondering. So maybe I missed this, but did you control for the role of COVID unemployment subsidies on the gender difference in COVID impact? If women are in industries that tend to be lower wages, and the subsidies, I think if I understand correctly, were generally not perfectly correlated with wages. They were flat. Wouldn't that also increase the gender difference in unemployment? Thank you.
So, so to the extent that this shows up at this level of the job type, then it would be kind of accounted for just by the differential trends by job type. It is possible, and well, in fact, it's the case that you have gender differences also conditional on job type. So, like even within a given cell of occupation times industry, you might still have differences, say, in pay. For example, wage gap in that particular cell, and yes, there could be some differences coming from that also.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if there's.
Sorry.
Is there time for just one brief question?
Yep.
From Shecession?
Yep.
Yeah, I was. I was just wondering about your the effect that you find no gender gap for jobs where people can work from home, and I'm wondering if that effect, if that finding will last over time. After all, people have been working from home in a makeshift way for a few months. And do you think that that is something that can continue, or would a gender gap show up over time?
Yes, and I think it's a very good point, and it's hard to tell right now, but I think it's also on my mind, because there is a strain, and people who have been working at home with kids,
right,
also at home, know this that you can do it for a while, but it's not really sustainable long term. And if the double duty falls more on women, they could very well be kind of a greater kind of resignation and ultimately decline in labor participation down the road. I think some of what we're seeing right now, you know, that participation is really lagging behind, and people are not coming back into the labor market as expected, is, you know, some of this effect, you know, this exhaustion that people are experiencing. And in fact, I mean, in the media, you find lots of people writing on this, and I think it's slowly starting to show up in the data too, you know. And so yes, so I think it is these more hard to measure but important effects that will show up more in the data down the road. Now, one is we're talking about exhaustion on the job. Of course, another thing we haven't talked about yet, which is the other side of that coin. Kids at home, you know, what's happened to the children? What's the impact on them? What's the impact on their education? What are also the repercussions of future childcare? You know, if the kids are struggling, that may well mean that that our childcare duties in the future will also be affected by this ongoing pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay. Thank you, Matthias. Thanks a lot. I would also like to thank all the participants. So then let us stop the session here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Great to see everybody.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Bye bye. Take care, Matthias. I'll talk to you.
Bye bye.